Colm is, by any standards, one of the most distinguished novelists writing in English. He's well known for powerful, controversial novels like The Heather Blazing, The Blackwater Lightship, The Master, Testament of Mary, Nora Webster, and his most recent work, House of Names, which is a reworking of classical tragedy. He's also a critic of great distinction, and I get this all the time just talking to him about literature. There's a superb book on the American poet Elizabeth Bishop, for instance, and some of you probably know he's written a book about fathers and sons, the fathers of Oscar Wilde and W.B. Yeats and James Joyce, with the fantastic title Mad, Bad, and Dangerous to Know. He's also a brilliant essayist, and I think this is a side of his work that deserves more attention. He's really lifted literary journalism to a new standard. He wrote what was by far the best essay on Easter 1916 in the centenary year. There was so much being written, but as an assessment of the role of writers in Easter 1916, it was just brilliant. And he's written about his own recent illness in a way that is just full of candour and comedy. And that's a great side to his work. So we're gathered here on a damp Sunday afternoon. Miss Kelly's grocery shop is closed now. We've got an hour with Colm. What I'm going to do is to ask him to read a short passage from Brooklyn. But before that, I just want to welcome him and introduce him to you. And maybe ask Colm just to give us his recollections of how Brooklyn came about, what it was that prompted the writing of it. Was there a catalyst? How did it happen? How did it start, Colm?
It started because I went to Texas, and I got a letter inviting me to come for a semester to teach at the University of Texas at Austin, and I went, and I really had put no thought into it. But when I arrived, I realised I probably made a mistake, and that it was just too far from the sea, just too far from the sea, basically, and too far from home. And especially in the mornings, waking up thinking, I wish I was at home and thinking about things in Ireland I don't even like. And, like Morning Ireland is a news programme, and I can't bear it, but I missed it, and Irish bread and Irish food. And so anyway, I did the semester and I came home and I thought I really better get back down to work. And I was writing a novel, and I had the first chapter written. It was a novel that became eventually the novel Nora Webster. And so I thought I should read the first chapter just to see where I was with it. And on about the third page, there was a story that became the story of Brooklyn. In other words, and it's a true story. In other words, when I was 12, my father died. He died in July, and right through maybe until November, December, people came to the house. Not as many as at the beginning, a lot, but then in ones and twos. And one evening, a woman came, an old woman, and she started to talk about her daughter who was in Brooklyn. She didn't say America, she didn't say Manhattan, Brooklyn. And when that woman left that evening, someone said something. Often, of course, when people left, it was marvellous. It's a gift to a novelist or a gossip, because you could find out everything. And someone said, that woman's daughter, the one in Brooklyn, she came home once. And then the story. And it was only half the story. It was just that, that she had come and taken her wedding ring off on the boat, and that she hadn't told them, that she hadn't told them for a long time, that she had got married. And just that. And there was nothing else, nothing about what she did while she was at home. And that was all I had. And there it was in about 4 sentences in Nora Webster. And it's still in Nora Webster. And I realised, I think 2 different things had been happening in the 14 weeks when I had been in Texas. I had been really trying to talk to students about arc, about a story that really has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and just seeing, like, a story needs to go up before it can come down. It cannot be flat. You must, even rhythmically, or in the tone, or in something you're doing, bring a story up. And I was going on about this, hammering all semester. No one listened to me, as usual. And I was also, in another class I was teaching, trying to talk about the 19th century, and particularly looking at Jane Austen's Mansfield Park, and also Henry James's Washington Square, two novels in which a young woman who is stubborn, but also not self-conscious, who is not a leader, but is, people always bully her around. She's not someone who looks in the mirror a lot, but someone who people almost like automatically, but she doesn't do anything to cause this. And I was just looking at how that happens. These two women in the fiction are great watchers, noticers, and they're very good at being quiet and retreating to their room. So that must have got into me in some way. I mean, I didn't consciously say, I need to write this, but I did then see the book, and I did see it in a few seconds. I saw it. But I thought it might be just a long story. I wasn't really clear how much detail it would take to build her and to take her to where she needed to go, and how much sort of rich detail that would yield, and that was how much I would have to describe it. And that's how the book got written. I mean, it wasn't, the other book was planned, and this book came as a sort of an accident. It was almost taken out of the other book.
So the passage I've asked Colm to read is part of the Christmas dinner scene. It's a very moving moment when Ailish is helping this Christmas dinner scene, and the parish priest, Father Flood, has invited the destitute and the homeless, the leftover Irish, he says, built the canals and the bridges and the roads. And I thought, just to take us into the novel, we'd ask Colm just to read a little bit from that section. It's the end of part 2 of the novel.
So this is our first Christmas away from home. And earlier in the day, a man has come in, an ordinary Irishman who's in New York has come in. And for a second, she thought it was her father, but her father is dead. And anyway, it's so far away from home, it's so impossible. But for a second, it's just the way he deals with the room, that whole way of sort of watching and noticing, for a second she thinks that, and then she's too busy serving all the food. And the two women who are supervising the whole event are both called Miss Murphy. They're sisters. By the time that they were removing the trifle dishes, the hall was a mass of smoke and animated talk. Men sat in groups with one or two standing behind them. Others moved from group to group, some with bottles of whiskey in brown paper bags that they passed around. When all the cleaning of the kitchen and the filling of garbage cans had been completed, Father Flood, who's the priest in charge of the whole thing, suggested that they go into the hall and join the men for a drink. Some visitors had arrived, including a few women, and Ailish thought as she sat down with a glass of sherry in her hand that it could have been a parish hall anywhere in Ireland on the night of a concert or a wedding, when the young people were all elsewhere dancing or standing at the bar. After a while, she noticed that 2 men had taken out fiddles and another a small accordion. They'd found a corner and were playing as a few others stood around and listened. Father Flood was moving about the hall with a notebook now, writing down names and addresses and nodding as old men spoke to him. After a while, he clapped his hands and called for silence, but it took a few minutes before he could get anyone's attention. "I don't want to interrupt the proceedings," he said, "but we'd like to thank a nice girl from Enniscorthy and 2 nice women from Arklow for their hard day's work." There was a round of applause. "And as a way of thanking them, there's one great singer in this hall, and we're delighted to see him this year again." He pointed to the man whom Ailish had mistaken for her father. He was sitting away from Ailish and Father Flood, but he stood up when his name was called and walked quietly towards them. He stood with his back to the wall so that everyone could see him. When Ailish looked up, the man was signalling to her. He wanted her, it seemed, to come and stand with him. It struck her for a second that he might want her to sing, so she shook her head, but he kept beckoning and people began to turn and look at her. She felt she had no choice but to leave her seat and approach him. She could not think why he wanted her. As she came close, she saw how bad his teeth were. He did not greet her or acknowledge her arrival, but closed his eyes and reached his hand towards hers and held it. The skin on the palm of his hand was soft. He gripped her hand tightly and began to move it in a faint circular motion as he started to sing. His voice was loud and strong and nasal. The Irish he sang in, she thought, must be Connemara Irish, because she remembered one teacher from Galway in the Mercy Convent who had that accent. He pronounced each word carefully and slowly, building up a wildness, a ferocity in the way he treated the melody. It was only when he came to the chorus that she understood the words. Ma viento lam biliam astoin Marie. And he glanced at her proudly, almost possessively, as he sang these lines. All the people in the hall watched him silently. There were 5 or 6 verses. He sang the words out with pure innocence and charm, so that at times when he closed his eyes, leaning his large frame against the wall, he did not seem like an old man at all. The strength of his voice and the confidence of his performance had taken over. And then each time he came to the chorus, he looked at her, letting the melody become sweeter by slowing down the pace, putting his head down then, managing to suggest even more that he had not merely learned the song, but that he meant it. Eilish knew how sorry this man was going to be, and how sorry she would be when the song had ended, when the last chorus had to be sung, and the singer would have to bow to the crowd and go back to his place and give way to another singer, as Eilish too went back and sat in her chair.
It's an episode that's done beautifully in the film, and Saoirse Ronan stands with her eyes filling with tears, and I was glad I had my handkerchief.
Yeah, I mean,
I saw it.
You know, if you're only the novelist and they're making a film, you get very little. But you've got to be careful what you ask for, because you can really only have one ask, and the one ask was, "Could you get me Iarla O'Linord?" And Iarla, I think he's the greatest singer of traditional music in Ireland. He's in a band called the Gloaming, and anyway, the director went to Iarla, and Iarla said, "I'm not an actor, you know." And I said, "Well, you're going to be on this particular film. You're going to be an actor, you know, because we need you." And he's the one who sings the song.
So, if you are mine, love of my heart, what was it about that song, Colm? Did you choose that for a particular?
It's a song that there's a singer called Joe Heaney, and he has a great version of it, and. Yeah, it just meant something to me. I mean, the melody did, the sound of it did, and even just putting the line in, even the reader wouldn't know what the music was. Yeah. I thought I would get other things right if I could just write that down right. You know.
Yeah. Does it matter to you that your novels can move people in that way? It might seem an old-fashioned thing to say about a novel, but there are moments like that that are capable of moving people deeply.
You see, I think with Brooklyn, where it's so personal, it's so private, it's so much in her mind, happening in small rooms, and I needed for one scene to broaden it out, to show that this actually happened to so many people, and so many people were broken by it. And the way to do this was really, instead of her having a sort of a melancholy Christmas day in the boarding house, which she easily could have had, where they're all missing home, to open it and to find another way into it, and where, you know, crowds come and she's busy, but you actually get a sense of Irish America in ways that you don't often see, in which people didn't make it, and which, you know, people really have nowhere to go at Christmas.
Yeah, it's obviously a novel that's very close to you, perhaps even autobiographical in some way, because it's the place where you grew up, it's Enniscorthy, but it's the decade that you grew up in as well. And also you worked in New York, you had that experience yourself of distance, dislocation. Would you say there was some autobiographical impulse there, as well as that story that you told us about, that you wanted to base it on?
Yes, I think there are two different things. One is, this was the period, I wrote this, was the period when a lot of the older generation had died. And it was, in a way of recovering certain moments from the past that we weren't going to get again. And really it was a question of imagining that one of my aunts, the younger of the two, that she had gone to America. And, there are tiny things in the book that only matter to me, but they're in the film too, where she works for a company called S&AG Davis. Well, that's where my two aunts worked in Enniscorthy. I named the place where they worked. And I just imagined that one of them, who the two sisters, one of them being not exactly bossy, but more ready for the world than the second one, and that she had gone to America. So that was the first thing. I was thinking about the way that generation of women in Ireland, the way they would talk about clothes and summer dresses and ladders and nylon stockings and things that have died out, really. And the second was that when I was 20, I went to Barcelona, and again on a whim, without thinking too much. And there are things in the book about letters coming, about waking up in the mornings, about different sounds, and all of this should have been, interesting and exotic. But at certain times they seemed very hard to be so far away from home. And this was 1975, but no one, making a phone call home would be we didn't have a phone at home. You'd have to phone a neighbour. And if my mother saw that neighbour coming up towards the house, she presumed it was bad news. So you couldn't really phone home. And it meant you went for months without speaking to anyone. And that had its ups and downs. It had its pluses, I have to say. There were moments where being anonymous in a big city is great if you're Irish, People knowing who your brother is and stuff. But then it has its downs. So I was sort of working with that idea of homesickness as something that comes in waves, like grief, that you can't control it, but you also, it be there one day and not the next, and you can't know.
Now, some writers would be very wary of entering the mind of a young woman. I'm thinking male writers particularly, and making a young woman the focus of your novel. That seems to be a challenge that you take on readily, and you've done it more than once.
I think at home, I don't know if anyone else has this experience, but if it was a Sunday and there were people around the house, like aunts and uncles, if you went upstairs, you'd find that all the women were gathered in my mother's bedroom or my parents' bedroom, and that they were swapping clothes and discussing the dress that Auntie Harriet nearly bought in Dublin. It was blue, but not the blue she wanted, but nearly the blue she wanted, and she nearly bought it. And then Auntie maybe said, and then shoes and stockings. And you would be 6 years old, and you'd be just looking at all of them. And no matter what they said, it would be whatever tone they used, it would be really interesting. And you'd go downstairs and find that there were 3 or 4 men, your father and a few uncles sitting around talking about some goal that nearly got scored on Sunday before. And that first goal. Oh, the second goal was good as well. And you just think, these are the most boring people. I'm going back upstairs. And because back upstairs they could, by that time, be talking about something really interesting, like a neighbour and what had happened with the neighbour. And then, but I found that women, that you got a sense of what didn't mean of women's interior lives, but at least what they would say, how they would appear, voices, clothes, preoccupations, ways of being social. Whereas with the men, it was just Samuel Beckett. It was just, it was Endgame was being performed.
One of the things that a lot of readers of Brooklyn and other works by Colm have pointed out is this acute, sensitive ear for speech, just turns of speech, little phrases that linger but mean a lot. And one example of this might be when Eilish hears her mother talking to a friend, and she says, when she goes, it'll kill me. And you leave it at that. Well, you say Eilish saw her mother's dark, strained face. Now that little phrase, it'll kill me, is a throwaway kind of colloquial phrase, but it's devastatingly right in the context.
Yeah, it's an Irish usage. I don't know what it is, if it's used here, but you know, always hear it, especially when you're growing up, and say, if you fail your exams, it'll kill your mother. It would be a constant threat, especially in your teenage years. If you come home once more with the smell of beer off you, it will kill your Aunt Mary, and you know about her and beer. You know the way that just always there. Yeah.
And the style of the novel, I suppose it's what traditionally we'd think of as third person or omniscient narrative rather than first person, and you could have told this in the first person voice of Eilish. But what you managed to do, and this is what I think it would be good to hear about, you managed to get into her thoughts, into her mind, and there are passages where you use the word mind or thoughts. Did you want something that would be written by a narrator, an all-knowing narrator, if you like, but would be intense enough and personal enough to represent Eilish's thoughts?
Yes, the theory of this, I think, is that if you do first person, you know, I went to America, I will kill my if I come home drunk, or if that is, you're actually distant from the person who's speaking. It's clearly someone else who's speaking, and you're watching their command of tone and idiom. But if you do she got up in the morning, or he, and if you moved intensely over what she noticed, it struck her, she remembered, she saw, she watched, and you do it over and over and over, you start bringing the reader into the protagonist's mind and even body. And the theory, what should happen is that, let's call this third person intimate, that you should almost become this person as you're reading, seeing the world, that you get used to seeing the world through this person's eyes. So as you turn the page, you sort of know how to, and worry enormously how they're going to respond to some piece of pressure. So it's actually, even though it shouldn't be, it's actually closer to the reader than a first person voice would be.
Yeah, and it's a very economical novel. I was just looking at the length of sentences and thinking that Henry James is someone you admire, and this is not a Henry James style of novel. It doesn't have sentences with 23 subclauses in. It's very spare, isn't it? Was that style something that you were conscious of, or does it just happen like that?
I was thinking particularly about the sort of scarcity of things in the 50s, of that there were no great flourishes, and that, you know, it wasn't just that when people got a television, obviously it's black and white, but there was an element of black and white photography, an element of black and whiteness even in the way things were conducted. So that there was no point in trying a big, glamorous prose style for quite reduced circumstances, reduced hopes, and in a way, small rooms. And also, Eilish's own, I think, consciousness is one in which there's a great deal of intelligence at work, but it's very quiet. It's subdued. It's under control. She's not someone who goes out into the world ready to take it over. She's someone who will move into the shadows. And you've got to find a style that matches that sort of, I suppose, subdued nature, subdued qualities.
Yeah. It's a novel full of work. I read again the opening line, which has the sister Rose coming from work. It opens with that. There's Miss Kelly's grocery store. There's the department store on Fulton Street. A lot of work. And the rhythms of work. And I started to think that this is quite like a lot of the big 19th century novels, novels like Middlemarch or Thomas Hardy's Far From the Madding Crowd, where the rhythms of work are important and run alongside the rhythms of love. And the rhythms of love and the rhythms of work sometimes run comfortably alongside each other, but sometimes they do collide.
Yeah, my mother worked in an office, and she prided herself she went back to work after my father died, but that, you know, there was before the adding machine, it was women who did the tots, and you could have 100 figures, and you'd have to come to a conclusion. And my mother said she never ever made a mistake because she prided herself on her tots, and my two aunts would have prided themselves similarly on their tots, and on that one aunt did wages, which in cash, which is notoriously difficult to do, because if you just get one thing wrong, you know, the money you have doesn't agree with the ledger, and the whole thing goes astray. And they would pride themselves on this, and also pride themselves on, you know, these are women who were born in the 20s, on their beautiful handwriting, which was very personal but totally legible. So I'm thinking about that idea of office work. And also there was a department store in Enniscorthy called Bulger's, and it had that hydraulic system where, there was a little cone and you sent it zooming through the shop and it came back and, oh my God. And so I had no trouble. I just moved that to Brooklyn. I mean, and the department store had the same sort of watchfulness where up above was someone who was the manager who could look down to see how somebody was being served. Yeah. And there were all sorts of class distinctions in who was served when or how people were treated and all that sort of.
So you've mentioned a few of the influences. There's one I'm thinking of. It's a novel that I know you and I admire a lot, a novel by an Irish writer called George Moore, Esther Waters, a working woman who has a child, a illegitimate child, while she's working at stables, and then we see her working in London, in Soho. I wondered if Esther Waters was on your mind at all.
Yeah, certainly. Esther Waters, just if you haven't read it, and it's really not as well known as it should be. It's a marvellous novel, and it's very good on the whole business of betting, betting wasn't allowed in pubs, and betting had to be organised, and people were losing a lot of money in the book. And it's also very good in the Plymouth Brethren. But yes, on that idea of someone who was alone in the world, who had been moved away from her family, who had to do by, and in the same way, people like Esther. They look after her in various ways, and she's very content in a certain way as well, but also stubborn in others. Esther Waters has a temper, which Eilish doesn't have. But yeah, she's certainly one of those great 19th century creations that would have been really useful in what is effectively a 19th century novel.
Yeah. It's a very cinematic novel in a lot of ways, and we're moving perhaps towards thinking about the film, that there are very rich episodes full of human interest and activity, like Miss Kelly's grocery store and the department store and the Coney Island visit where she puts a swimming suit on for the first time, and the baseball game. Did it occur to you at all when you were writing that this might one day be a film?
No, I mean, I think if you did that when you're writing, you really would lose the book, and quite rightly, deservedly. In other words, just write the scene. And honestly, I would have thought the story was too small and too Irish, and it didn't occur to me until afterwards, when someone said it to me. We would like to do this, and even then I thought this is too quiet, or the what's at stake is just. It really didn't occur to me.
Yeah. There's a lovely moment, and I hope this is something that those of you who are seeing the film later will look out for. I just saw it at the Tyneside Cinema in Newcastle, and as Eilish is arriving and going through customs, I caught sight of Colm with his suitcase, and I had to look again and realised it was an Alfred Hitchcock cameo part. So I wanted to check it was you, and how did that?
They were shooting in Montreal, and I went up, and someone had a bright idea that there was actually a trailer empty. Someone had gone, they'd done some shooting, and they could put my name on it, and I could leave my stuff in there. And then they thought it was really funny, as though I was some sort of famous actor too. And then someone said, well, why don't you? And then I got dressed, and I had to get up early in the morning, and I had to do all that, yeah. And I mean, for that tiny shot, 10 takes and then 10 more takes. 10 takes where they catch you here, and then 10 takes where they catch you walking. And you think, well, so Saoirse and myself became really good friends during those 20 takes, because we had so much time in between to talk about various things. Yeah.
Well, I think we're getting near the time where we'd like to talk with you, and I think there are some roaming mics. There should be one for upstairs as well, and I think we might have a little more light so we can see you. And please feel free to talk with Colm, and any questions? Has the mic reached anyone?
There's somebody in the front row.
Great. Do you want to wait for the mic to reach you and shout? You should.
Who are the Irish writers that we've missed in the UK, do you think?
Who are the Irish writers? I'll repeat the question, that's fine. Who are the Irish writers that we've missed in the UK? Well, I think George Moore is one. That particular novel, Esther Waters. And, there's a figure called Eugene McCabe, and they made a version of his novel, Death and Nightingales, for TV recently. The BBC made it, but the novel is so much better than the film, I think. It's called Death and Nightingales, and it's by Eugene McCabe, and also Eugene McCabe's short stories. Now, there's Patrick McCabe, who wrote The Butcher Boy, and there's Eugene McCabe, who wrote Death and Nightingales. But I presume you know Patrick McCabe, because The Butcher Boy did very well everywhere, really. But I think Eugene McCabe would be one example. There's a tiny little book, which I think Faber has published here, by Claire Keegan, and it's called Foster. I think it's only 100 pages. Well, I think it's a little masterpiece. And I think every single image in it is perfect. I can't think how many times I've read it. And Foster, Claire Keegan.
So there's your reading list for you. Yeah. Yeah, please put your hand up, and we'll try to get the mic to you.
I think writing novels isn't like having children, and I'm wondering if you can admit to a favourite.
I suppose there's one story, there's a long story at the end of the book called Mothers and Sons, which is called A Long Winter. And again, it's that idea of, it's almost like with Brooklyn, someone telling you half a story. And someone told me, I was in the Pyrenees, that years before, decades before, a woman in the winter who was drinking, she was a married woman, had some row with her husband and walked out of the house to go back to her own village. And the sky was blue, but it was a winter day, and snow could come very, very fast on a day like that. And it can really be high. And she got buried in the snow and was killed, but they couldn't find her body until the thaw. In other words, the snow would come, and then it would be there for 3 or 4 months. And I just thought, oh my God, I couldn't find her body, but they knew it was out there somewhere in the snow. And I started to give her a son, and I started to have him going out every day. And so that story is about 80 pages or 90 pages. God, I worked so hard on that, and because I felt that thing I'm talking about, the arc, the thing that I thought, it was like a folk tale. It had a shape to it. And I think that is the orphan child, really, or is the one that I would give the most cream to in the morning.
Anyone up there? Yeah. Have you got the mic?
All right. Okay. When I heard you talk about your visit to America and even longing for the breakfast show that you really hated, I came to think of Brian Friel's play, Philadelphia, Here I Come, which has been very important to me. Is there anything you'd like to say about it, or do you know?
Yeah. Brian Friel's play, Philadelphia, Here I Come, and there's a second play called The Loves of Cass McGuire, which is about a woman who goes to America and comes back. Certainly those two, Philadelphia, Here I Come is about is a guy who's about to leave, and it's the whole idea of the last summer he's going to have, which is almost there in Brian Friel's Dancing at Lunasa as well. This idea of catching the moment before it ends. And I think almost every Irish writer has some version of this story. In recent times, Sebastian Barry, but it's there in James Joyce in a short story called Eveline in the book Dubliners, that she's someone who almost leaves. And so I think that idea of leaving and returning, it's in plays by Tom Murphy as well. And in Irish mythology, the idea of the returned Yank, of someone coming back with dollars and a big American accent and oil millionaire and stuff. I mean, that lives on in the mythology of somehow or other that America is where it's all, where it's all to be made. And Friel was dealing with that in I think it's a marvelous play.
Yeah.
Philadelphia, Here I Come.
There's a beautiful story by John McGahern, Korea. I didn't realise that parents could get money for Irish boys conscripted into the war in Korea. And this boy is out with his father fishing and wonders if his father loves him, and wonders, does his father have this idea of selling him on, if you like, to fight.
And there's that image of America as the place to go in Korea, and someone has already come home in a coffin from Korea. Yeah. I think it's a haunting. Yeah. It's a haunting presence in the literature in a way that it isn't in the literature of the other, I hesitate to say European countries, but you know what I mean. I can't. You're worried about saying European at the moment without having to go into a big explanation for what you mean. But I mean, you don't get it very, very much in German writing, French writing, or even that much in English writing.
Keep those questions coming. Where are we?
Thank you. Dreading this already. I'm on the last 30 pages of Brooklyn. It's fantastic. Mr. Tóibín, are you an Irish writer or a writer in English?
I think that, I think the first, one of the interesting things about Irish writing is that you almost put a flag up over a very particular place that's not Ireland, but is, say, Enniscorthy, where I'm from, and is not anywhere else. In other words, when you're talking about Philadelphia, Here I Come, it's very much where Brian Friel is from in Ireland. And so I would say, I suppose, the first thing is that I'm very clearly from those streets, from that small world, and that's what the Irish thing almost comes second. And then the English language thing is even stranger, where you think, well, surely, I mean, James Joyce ponders on this and dramatizes it. The idea of how could English be your language if you're Irish, since Irish Gaelic really is your language. But that's not how language works. I mean, language is such a natural and essential thing. It's as important as blood. And so the first language you learn to speak is your language, no matter how it came, with an army, or naturally, or organically. It happens to be yours by some accident of history. But the accident of history hardly matters if you're starting to know the world by courtesy of that language, whatever the language is. So, there's a great irony surrounding what has happened to English all over the world, and how English has become, it belongs to so many different people. But yeah, I'm from Enniscorthy. And I'm from, not only that, you could narrow it down even, I'm from, that side of the river and not the other side of the river. You could get it. The parish.
Again at the front, yeah.
Since I read Blackwater, may have asked you this before, since I read the Blackwater Lightship, and I suppose the stories from Dark Times and so on, I feel as though I've been waiting for that great sort of gay novel to come, to come from you that would kind of tie together so many of the themes that otherwise get hidden. I mean, when they come in the master in very, very subdued and self-consciously repressed ways. And I just wondered whether, have you still got plans? Because sometimes you have talked about.
Things have really changed since I wrote those books. I mean, some of it has been really funny. I was in America, and it was a Sunday, and someone was early, and someone called, phone rang and said, just put on the phone, but just get Irish radio, turn it on now. And, I could do that on the computer. I could get, live, whatever it's called. And it was Leo Radker, who's now the Taoiseach, who was Minister for Health, who was a policy wonk. And I thought, God, Leo's going to bore us now with some white paper on some matter, some statistics. And Leo was saying in the middle of an interview about everything, he was suddenly said, well, as a gay man, and the interviewer said, hold on, Leo, what did you just say? Did you just say, as a gay man, I? And that was Leo. And about a week later, a politician from the other party, from Fianna Fáil, who has shown no sign, in my opinion, of showing any sort of sexuality ever, at all, of any type, he announced that he was gay all along too. And then a woman who was a TV presenter and a newsreader, everyone really liked her and thought they knew her. And she said, no, you don't know me because I'm a lesbian all along. And the whole country turned suddenly, over a period of months, just the whole country became, I mean, it was so fashionable that I kept saying to friends of mine, you two, are you, your mother, your granny, like someone in your family? And then the referendum happened, and it was a referendum on same-sex marriage, and it was passed by a big majority. And the answer to your question is, I think I know what I need to do with that. I think I've written the beginning of it. It's going to take a while, but yes, obviously, all that business has been so interesting. That change that has happened in my lifetime in Ireland, from the unimaginable, that the idea, from the unmentionable to the unimaginable, to the slow business of change, and then the sudden change. And then the whole country has now gone back to normal. You were glad to hear it. But it was a funny time. That was a funny time. And Leo is now at the tea shop, and he's very popular. He's even more popular because the myth beginning to govern things in Ireland, I don't know if you can imagine it from this side, but in Ireland it looks like he came over to England last week, and he said something to Boris, which caused Boris to see sense. And so he's a big hero in Ireland. I mean, you have no idea what that looks like from our side. Leo is a big hero. I mean, Eamon de Valera couldn't do it. Patrick Pearse couldn't do it. Leo has done it. And if he called an election in the morning, it would be a landslide. Does that answer your question?
Keep those questions coming.
Hello. I thoroughly enjoyed Brooklyn. I thought it was wonderful. It's one of the only books I've ever read where I've listened in my head to the accents of the person who was who was speaking, which I found a bit unsettling at times. Both my parents were Irish. I also wondered, have you ever considered doing a sequel to it so we could find out what happened to Eilish?
Oh my God. I mean, part of the problem is that it's very difficult once you move into the 60s to get every detail of American reality right. Even American speech, or even what they called things. Did they call, the refrigerator, but, the automobile, the whole business of even the technological words, but also just ordinary American speech. So there she is in Brooklyn, but I can't work out how they all talk. But I'll have to spend more time in America just listening really carefully, see what they say. I'll try.
I wanted to say earlier that 3,000 copies of Brooklyn have been distributed during the past couple of weeks. There's a special edition, which is the Durham Book Festival Big Read edition. So copies of Brooklyn have gone to community centres, businesses, to Law Newton and Franklin prisons. And we had a message during the week from the librarian at Franklin, Jackie, who said it was a novel that had touched people deeply, the sense of loneliness that you explore in the novel, but also the importance of decisions and the significance of making bad decisions, wrong decisions. And that led me to wonder if you think novels can still have an ethical function. And I don't mean in a dogmatic or preaching kind of way, but do you like to think that novels have that capacity, even if it's just that capacity to make people think again?
I think with a novel, more than a film or a play, you can show what someone is thinking, and you can show what they're feeling, and then you can show what they're saying, and you can see the difference between those things. You can also watch in a novel as somebody does something ill-considered, which they themselves at the time put no thought into, but you as the reader can see, and wish they could also see, as you can see, that this really needs a lot more thought. And in a way, that's part of the pleasure of reading a novel, where you can feel slightly superior to the protagonist in that, oh, now, that isn't wise, but you've just, oh. And whereas the protagonist, you can see how almost easy those decisions were to make, how natural they seemed at the time, but how the repercussions of them were not envisaged in full. Yes, so all that ethical minefield and all that ethical maze is really what a novel is dealing with. I mean, not necessarily over what's right morally or wrong morally, but what has repercussions, what is unwise. I think you can see those things working all the time. There's a man up there, there's a man. Oh, sorry.
Hi. Just reflecting on Eilish's story of leaving and the bittersweet nature of leaving, and tying that in with your personal journey as you've left Ireland and lived in other places, would you say the advantages of leaving outweigh the disadvantages of staying?
I think if you have a family of 5, there's always one who would love to go. And there's always one who really loves home, loves the routine, loves the ritual, loves knowing everyone, loves the familiar streets. And so I think it absolutely depends on the it's an aspect of DNA, it's an aspect of the personality. And there's no true way to live. And there's always someone who isn't settled, isn't ever ready to settle, always wants something more. And there's always somebody else who wants to sort of marry young, settle down, and be out for a walk on a Sunday with a pram before they're 25. And that's just the difference between people. But I wouldn't like to make any rules.
I imagine that telling a story through writing a book and producing a film to tell the same story are very different processes. When it comes to somebody making a film from your book, were there any particular instances where the director wanted to go in one particular direction and insisted on it, that he had to do that you didn't want?
I didn't write the screenplay. I mean, very deliberately, I didn't write the screenplay. The reason was I didn't want to revisit it and then have to go to a meeting of people to say, we want this change, and that change, and I would have to go home and rethink it. So I didn't want to write it. The first thing I said to the producer was, can you get me Nick Hornby? And once Nick was on board, my job was to leave Nick alone and not call him up. And I didn't have a number for him or an email address for him. And he, I noticed, didn't contact me. In other words, that's his job now, and my job is to keep away. When it came to I think maybe the third draft of the screenplay, I met him. There were just one or two words, because we're talking about local usage, that I felt needed to be much more local, just to sound true. But it was down to words. And what happens with me when I watch the film is that the ending, which I didn't write, it isn't in the book, seems really emotional to me. And I love it. And I tear up during it. And so I don't mind it. I mean, I was, oh my God, look what she's going to do. And I love, I'm really a big softie suddenly. And therefore, I think I did something really wise for once by just leaving everyone else alone and just letting them get on with it. And I was lucky then that what Nick did and what the John Crowley, the director, did was, for me, it satisfied me as a film. So I had nothing to moan about, and that was good.
Can I ask, I've heard it say some authors have a book planned, but when they start writing it, the characters start to take over. Has that happened to you?
That I always have things planned. I always have something on the go. And then what's strange is when you least expect it, something else can come into your mind and seem absolutely vivid and ready to start with. And the other thing is lovely because it's always there to be done. Go back to it when you're ready. But the thing that comes, and I think that happened to me with the novel Blackwater Lightship, it happened with Brooklyn, it's happened with some short stories, where it isn't that the characters take over, it's that the story itself suddenly seems absolutely right. Whatever has been happening, whatever is going on in your unconscious, hits a narrative, and you're away. And it's very surprising. And if you tried to force it, you wouldn't get it. And if you expected it to come, it wouldn't come. And it's always a great surprise. John McGahern, who you mentioned, who is an Irish novelist, I don't know if we were talking about Irish books, but he's certainly the great Irish novelist of the second half of the 20th century. John McGahern, he used to say, do you know what I'm hoping for? And I would know what he was hoping for, but I would say, what? And he would say, I'm hoping not to have another idea until after Christmas. And he could say this early in the year, you know, because it meant he was going to have to work.
And he was here in Durham in the early 70s, I think, John McGahern. I'm watching the clock, just remembering that there is a screening of Brooklyn in about 15 minutes' time, so I think we should draw this to a close, but there are books to be signed, and what we'd like to suggest is that if you are planning to see the film, that you join one line and everyone else is kind enough to let you have your book signed so that you can do that and get along to the film. So I hope that's okay. But I just wanted to say that it's been such a great pleasure to sit here and talk with Colm, who's been so candid and good-humoured and so giving in all of his responses to these questions. And as I say, I hoped one day that he'd make it here, and he has, and I hope he'll be back, that we'll bring you back here again, Colm. I hope so. Let's give him a big round of applause.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.